you get enlightened by doing things that are necessary that you really, really, really do not want to know, don't want to do. And imagining yourself as a perpetrator of that sort that tells you something about the world, and it tells you something about human beings, but it's a hell of a thing to swallow, you know, in a very well structured society like ours, where we're so peaceful. Well, because we have the heat and it always works, and we have electricity and it always works, and we have plumbing, which is a bloody miracle, and it always works. You know, it's just one of the things that this imagination process has done for me is keep me alert to the absolute miracle that my life is every day. It's horribly cold out there, you can't grow any food, you die if you're out there for 24 hours. If any of this infrastructure was unreliable for any length of time, we would be in serious trouble. And it's never unreliable. It's so unlikely. And so here we are with all this reliable infrastructure, and because of that we don't really have to compete with each other much. I mean, you don't compete for food, you don't compete for shelter, or some people do, but not very many. So it's really easy to think of yourself as good, because, well, you're not doing anything nasty to anyone. But, you know, a cynic might say, well, that's just because you don't have any reason to. But those reasons have arisen many times in the past, and in fact they're the norm, not the exception. We're the exception. This insanely functional society that we've somehow managed to generate it's incomprehensible to me that it exists. So anyways, back in the end of the Industrial Revolution, you know, the conditions of the worker were pretty brutal. I mean, George Orwell wrote a book called Road to Wigan Pier, which I would highly recommend. It's a great book. And he went up in the 30s, I think it was the 30s, to live with the coal miners up in northern UK. And those poor guys, you know, they had to crawl to work for 2 miles down a tunnel that they couldn't stand up in just to start their shift. And then after their 8 hours of, you know, hacking away at the coal walls, which is rather difficult and dirty and dangerous, and of course you get black lung from it, so it's also fatal, and of course they didn't get paid very much. So after doing that for 8 hours, then you crawled back your 2 miles, and you didn't get paid for that. That was just the commute. And the housing for those people was not good, the food wasn't good, most of them had no teeth by the time they were 30. You know, I mean, being poor was no joke, even in a place like the UK, which was relatively well off. And so there was every reason to be concerned about the disparity between rich and poor. And poor is the natural state, you know, that in the Western world in 1895 the typical person lived on $1 a day in today's dollars. And you know, that's not uncommon in many places in the world now. So there were reasons to be concerned with inequality. And you know, the Russians took one pathway inspired by Marx, and we took another pathway inspired by John Stuart Mill and John Locke and the English tradition, I would say, of democracy, and competed for 70 years, and things seem to have worked out better here. But it was a hell of a competition, and there were real differences in opinion at the bottom of it, and those two systems turned into armed camps. And that's not over exactly, you know. I mean, there's the Chinese, although they're a hybrid now between communism and capitalism, and hopefully they're more interested in getting rich than they are in, you know, having a war. Greed is a good motivator, surprisingly enough. It's kind of reliable. But anyways, by 1989 the jig was up. It was obvious that the Soviet system was not functional. There were no consumer goods, that's for sure, even in the main department stores in Moscow, and people just kind of lost faith in the whole project. You know, it became, for a while, I don't know if you know about the show Dallas. Dallas was a soap opera that ran at night, a serial, and it was about these rich Texans who lived, you know, a 1% lifestyle, and it was the most popular show in East Germany. The streets would empty so that people could watch Dallas. Well, when you're sitting in your horrible Soviet architecture flat that, you know, you had to struggle to get with your informing relatives, because 1 out of 3 people in East Germany was an informer, a government informer, and you watch Dallas, you know, there's a little cognitive dissonance occurring, and so it fell apart, and quite peacefully actually. You know, there was a bit of war in Eastern Europe, but it fell apart remarkably peacefully, and so here we are, and we don't know what to do with the pesky Russians, but at least there's no evidence that there are mortal enemies for fundamental reasons of axiomatic presupposition. And things are a lot better in the world, despite what everyone tells you, than they were 40 years ago, and they're so much better than they were 50 years ago that it's absolutely staggering. We've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 15 years that have been lifted out of poverty in the entire history of the world before then. People are gathering economic resources at a rate that even the wildest optimist really couldn't dream of speeding up. So it's not like we're without our problems, but so during that period of time,